Thank you, and my thanks to the Academy of Medicine and its foundation for giving me this opportunity to tell you something about my institution. I don't often have an opportunity to see the people from the medical community I come from. The scientific paradigm, which at least our French colleagues grew up with, is a scientific paradigm based on the idea that you've got to focus on analyzing problems and that solutions will then flow from this without too much trouble. But when, as is the case now, you are facing causal chains which are increasingly complex, with multiple interactions, it does indeed shake up the paradigm somewhat, especially if you want to find solutions and adapt as one should. So when the world's problems are worsening, I shan't give details, Dominique already mentioned this in terms of health. So complex causalities, you have the Sargas crisis, which can have very serious consequences for tourism, but also for health. IRD's latest expedition with the Brazilian scientists shows that the worsening of the phenomenon is due to cash crops and the micronutrient load of the Amazon basin. So this is a very important health issue. So how can you find solutions to this type of situation? Well, of course, at IRD, even though you can be critical, there is the UN SDG framework with its 17 goals, and there is SDG 3 on health and well-being, and it is very comprehensive, covering almost all areas, which is a good thing compared to the Millennium Goals, which focus on infectious diseases or mother and child protection, however important, of course, those are. But 17 goals, 169 targets, 283 indicators, and rising. So it's a little difficult to avoid what the UN calls a transformation of the exercise into a beauty contest, where everybody comes to New York regularly to say they have ticked 167 boxes and that they're making wonderful progress. So the way I see things, and I'll tell you why, is slightly different. Indeed, it is my honor and duty to be a member of the group of 15 experts which the Secretary General and the Security Council has asked to draft the report for 2019. What we want to do is to avoid the beauty contest and see how science can help to find solutions which will be different according to country, context, and level of development, but with a view to sustainable development and finding the best possible levers. Now, before talking about innovation and what IRD is doing with the partners to the south in this respect, I can't avoid saying that, of course, this isn't something which can solve everything, and in particular, it cannot solve macroeconomic issues. Now, these problems are simple. When I was a health econometrist, I made studies, and what we saw was that in optimistic projections in terms of growth rate, demographic dynamics, etc., in those relatively optimistic scenarios, at best in 2030 in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, health expenditure possible in 2030 at the end of the SDGs were less than $100 per person. If you took household expenditure and public expenditure also on the part of the states with the support of international aid, $100 per individual is not enough. It is impossible, even with all possible frugal innovations, etc., with all the optimizing of systems you could imagine, it just won't work out. And all economists agree that it isn't enough. So if we want to avoid a negative outcome, or at least only a partial outcome by 2030, these are issues that have to be looked into, i.e. funding. Now, the second issue, which is also quite topical with IRD and our colleagues in Congo and elsewhere are in the front line. I'm referring to the outbreak of Ebola in the DRC. Professor Gentilini, for instance, is even better versed in this than I could be. So here we have a very complicated social phenomenon as well. During the previous Ebola epidemic, humanitarian aid was refused. You see an instance of this in Equatorial Guinea. There were riots, unprecedented. And my teams and I are very concerned if there's insufficient coordination in the field in the DRC, because on the one hand you have teams for diagnostics and sequencing and other teams, and quite rightly so, for vaccination trials. There's the fact that these vaccines, of course, bring about fever peaks. I am very, very worried. I hope I'm wrong, but you really have to take into account the level of acceptance of population, even when you come in with the best possible humanitarian intentions. So macro-social issues, because there are elites also in these countries which feed in to this defiance of international institutions. So beyond that, without settling these issues, which are multilateral political and social issues, science can, however, contribute and bring in a contribution, but that does mean that the scientific paradigm must be changed, at least in part. In other areas, because IRD doesn't only work in the field of health, I'd say that we are lagging behind the need to have an interdisciplinary a platform for sustainability science, and it is not something which is ecology, borderline ecology, etc. It's really very mainstream. The National Academy of Science wants to work at this, and all the scientific journals are publishing in this area. For instance, the Lancet has its a supplement which deals with sustainability science. So the fact that science can give solutions and contributes to innovation, even though it's not the source of innovation, all this implies that we have to adopt a multilateral approach. We have to be collaborative. It means that we must leave aside the various stereotypes. Achieving SDGs, especially in health, cannot be done solely based on public budgets. So there has to be cooperation with the private sector, that is the commercial private sector, but also civil society. If you don't have partnerships between the various players, there will be no possible sustainable development. So we must overcome opposition and find ways to cooperate at these various levels. Now, we try to contribute to this modestly. Sarah Marniès is in charge of these things at IRD. For instance, through the promotion of innovation campuses in France, there's one in Bondy near Paris, but also mirror campuses which are springing up. It's our initiative, but also other people's and institutions' initiative. And we have actions in Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire, and I travel a lot to those countries, especially in Africa, and it is a source of optimism, but at the same time it can make one feel pessimistic. Optimism because there are some problems which concern us here in France, which are no longer a true problem for the African youth. And they are committed in spite of all the difficulties, whereas here they can bring about serious difficulties. That is also reverse innovation. Understanding what our colleagues are doing in the South to allow us to take a more critical and efficient view of what is happening here. So there are quite a few examples of innovations, which, of course, we couldn't have contributed to if we hadn't let them with scientists, with physicians in countries to the south, but also, more often than not, with the communities concerned. For instance, we have Nutriset, that's the Plumpy Nut effort, which is a pace against infant malnutrition. It's also the mosquito nets. Now, let me tell you a little story to explain why I am CEO of IRD. Well, simply because I spent some time with Michel Kazatchkine when he was executive director of the World Fund, and at the time I was in charge of malaria. So I lived with the international malaria community, and I kept hearing about these mosquito nets. And it's only when I got back to Marseille for the inauguration by Valérie Pécresse of the IRD headquarters. So I came back to France after 3 years. And the minister, Valérie Pécresse, told me that it was researchers of IRD, together with their colleagues in Côte d'Ivoire, who had come up with these mosquito nets, these impregnated mosquito nets. So you can be surprised. And to follow up on what our Indian colleague was saying, we have a prototype in Burkina Faso, and we're trying to extend it to all of Africa using satellite imagery in order to act in real time when there are traffic accidents on the streets of Ouagadougou and other African capitals. Now, there are many other things. I can't go into the details. We can also combine digital systems, a satellite imaging system, and the know-how and skills in the various areas to improve knowledge, but also improve the action we can take, for instance, health monitoring. Now, regarding fast diagnostic tests for neglected diseases, and this implies that you have to calibrate efficiently. You have to find the right balance between private and public. For the diagnosis of these diseases, the problem is that the market isn't enough to attract investment for research and development from the private sector. So we have to find incentives to bring in the private sector, and then to do this, we have to stress public investment more heavily. And we do have a project for neglected diseases with the Institut Pasteur at Mérieux and the R&D teams in order to develop the production of these diagnostic tests. And then there's also interdisciplinary work, which we really think is a good idea in terms of innovation for food safety, etc. For instance, the production of edible insects. Some very interesting work is being done in Cameroon and Burkina Faso in particular. So, of course, that means partnerships between North and South, collaboration also with WHO. Project is being set up with France and a number of other countries, including Côte d'Ivoire. So, reverse innovation is something which does indeed inspire us. And let me just tell you one more thing about my personal experience. Reverse innovation is technology, but it's also institutional and social. Together with my friends Michel Rancourt and Didier Raoul, some of you may know them. They are biologists at the Institut Méditerranée Infection. They develop techniques which we call point of care, easy to implant, immunochromatography, and experiments were successful. All you need is a bit of electricity, and even in the middle of nowhere, in Senegal and elsewhere in Africa, you get results with differential diagnosis of fevers or tuberculosis in very lean technological environments. So my input there was that it was very cost efficient compared to other diagnostic techniques. My friend Didier had an idea and felt it could be useful in the Marseille Hôpital Nord hospital with this point of care at the patient's bedside. So the bacteriological laboratory and then the infectious biology laboratory were no longer needed, because 95 to 97% of diagnosis was carried out at the bedside, and only a few samples had to be sent back to the center at the Timone Hospital. So you can imagine that even though the hospital managers were delighted, as were the bacteriologists and health econometrists, and I was one of them. But just imagine what this brought about within the hospital. There was a slightly less enthusiasm, shall one say. So we have to think about our practices, we have to think about our own innovations, and that is why at IRD, together with the help of many others, we try to attract all this, not only in the spirit of international solidarity and development. It's simply that we also have to organize our own systems.